All right. Hello, everybody. DML here, coach at the University of Michigan. And today for this webinar, we are delighted to have joining us Professor Jarius Grove, who's the professor and director of the Center for Future Studies at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and a former debater and coach for the University of Texas, Austin. As I understand it, a NDT semifinalist.
Although I think I coached at Harvard longer than I coached at Northwestern and Texas, but yeah, UT
makes sense.
All
right, well, take it away.
Great. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, let me see if, yeah, here are all panelists. All right, should be good.
Okay, let's see if it'll let me do it now. Share. Uh-oh. Can choose to put it data. Okay. I think this will work. What can you see right now?
Nothing as of right now. Or well, still you. I'm also, if you want to, oh, there we go. Cool. Now I can see it.
Awesome. All right, let's see if we can make the pictures work, as everybody likes pictures. Now let's see if we'll play. Why aren't we working? All right. Can you see a screen that says what comes after the future? Yeah, okay, good. I asked because I did this talk at National Intelligence University like 2 weeks ago, and we were on Teams, and I was like halfway through the talk when finally someone called me on my cell phone and they said, we've just been looking at a black screen for like 25 minutes. So I now double check in the age of Zoom. So here's what I'll try to do. I'll say some things about kind of where the book fits in, because I straddle a lot of different fields. I'm mostly in war studies, which is a little bit different than international relations, but I do a lot of work on geopolitics. And I'm director of a futures research center, which means that I do a lot of long-term policy work for like the South Korean government and Japan and the Air Force and Army and lots of self-determination groups that want to know things like, you know, Chamorros and Gohan and Hawaiian folks here. And I'm spread in some pretty different directions, which I think maybe some people have questions about because they always think it's weird that I'm willing to argue with the military and argue with people who are trying to overthrow colonialism. I don't know, really weird, but so I'll try to give you some of the broad strokes concepts of the book in case you're not familiar with it and my work, and I'll do my best to think about how to connect it to some of the questions you all are debating this year. I missed the criminal justice topic on both sides of my career. It was the year after I graduated from high school, I think, and it was the year before I got to college. So, you know, I debated the civil rights topic, but not criminal procedure, which I think is what you're debating this year. Okay, so what comes after the future? You know, because I work at a future center, I work a lot with people who are very convinced that they know what the future is. We work with a lot of people from Singularity University, from Silicon Valley more broadly, who are very convinced that the world will become more manageable, not less. And I also work in international relations and was sort of finishing my PhD at a time when international relations was increasingly convinced that war was coming to an end. And I think if I think about where the book came from, it's really at that intersection. It's trying to get people to rethink the confidence they had in how the future will turn out, and rethink the confidence they had that we had captured in some way the kind of essence of war, and we could measure it, and that measurement was telling us that war was on the decline. And my experience in the world was that was far from the truth, but also represented a real, you know, I think, hole in the logic of international relations reasoning. So, you know, part of this too is trying to think through what kinds of futures we've thought about in the past, and also how the future frames what kinds of things we can think. I think one of the sort of differences between the center that I run at Hawaii and say like the University of Houston's Future Center, which does foresight work, that we actually start from the premise that the future doesn't exist. Rather than the future being something that you can define and see through trend lines, we're trying to think about the ways that our images of the future constrain how we think what is and isn't possible. And I think there's been a long process of trying to get over kind of, I would call the 70s hangover of futures, which was this vision that we were going to live in a post-scarcity world, that eventually we would get to a world without limits. This is what I would call the Star Trek Next Generation future. And that it would be a kind of post-identity future. This is Carl Sagan's Pale Blue Dot, which if you haven't listened to, you should, because as critical as I am of it, it's also really touching. It's this image of this idea that humanity would leave Earth. We get so far from Earth that Earth would only be a star. And that by that time, the kinds of racial, historical, economic differences, gender differences, sex differences that we see now would have become something like a historical artifact. And then the last part of this sort of, futures hangover from the 70s is that future would be post-political. Post-politics, in this context, you all who cut your teeth on Slavoj Žižek think it's a little bit different. It's a sort of vision of liberalism that developed in the early 20th century, which presumed that every major conflict in politics, from war to the structure of the market economy, was really only a technical question, right? So if we could fix the distribution questions, if we could figure out a way, engineer our way out of scarcity, if we could figure out how to engineer our way out of difference, then politics would cease to exist. We wouldn't need it anymore, unless we found Romulans. So I'm trying to figure out ways in which we can think about the future productively, but not fall into this trap of thinking that the best thing that we can imagine is basically an end to politics. And instead, that attempt to try to find an end to politics doesn't lead to what they'd hoped for, which is a kind of post-competition future, running from Immanuel Kant all the way through, again, to Star Trek, where there'd be a kind of global confederacy or world state. But instead, that's actually what the competition would be over. It would be a fight, and this is the words that I use in the book, over forms of life, meaning that we'd fight over what kind of life we wanted for humanity, even what kind of species we wanted humanity to become. And so as those things became more prescient as either because of climate change or CRISPR technology or the capacity to upload ourselves to data banks, that would actually intensify the competition that we think of as politics rather than diminishing it. And so one of the things that I argue is that we have to get over this idea that we're sort of where, Hegel, the great German idealist philosopher, called history at dusk, that we are somehow at the end of history. And despite how badly the end of history thesis was sort of disproven after the 90s and the end of the Cold War and the sort of resurgence of various kinds of violence around the planet for ideological reasons, we still try to resurrect it. So now we don't make the kind of liberalism argument that somehow liberalism and liberal democracy and market economies are the end of history. Now we talk about things like the fourth industrial revolution and this idea that the digital age will be the capacity to overcome these limitations, which seem to say that the sort of post-scarcity, post-political futures wouldn't be possible. And these versions are related to those 70s versions, but different. So my favorite one after living in the Gulf for a year is that the economic future is data. Data is the new oil. The UAE loves to talk about this, that they're going to dominate the market through data collection in the same way as they create through oil. And the reason why this is supposed to get to us, of course, to a post-scarcity future is that data somehow isn't scarce like oil is. That if we can produce value from data, we can get somewhere else. One, that the future of governance will also be automated. So maybe we can't get through politics in the same way, but we can master governance. And this would be something like the Chinese social credit system for everyone, or something like the US credit system, but applied outside the realm of finance and your capacity to apply for loans, but actually applied to everything from getting into school to what kinds of jobs you got, which, to be fair, we're actually much closer to than I think people think. And last, that the way out of the ecological future from this sort of digital version of the end of history, blockchain everything, automated labor, the Internet of Things, and hyper efficiency. So the idea, I actually just met with a futurist not that long ago who wanted to use blockchain to actually manage the ocean. We were going to basically assign every fish that had commercial value a different code, which would allow for universal tracking and surveillance. And lastly, and we can actually already see this, particularly in the sort of vision that the US military has of the fourth offset and China's attempt to try to reach general artificial intelligence, as well as Russia, that the future of peace is also in data. In this case, the vision is not one of an egalitarian or a confederated peace, like the liberal vision, but in total dominance, right? So sort of full-blown hegemony, dominance of the space domain, that would mean their kind of ultimate high ground, and the end of war would come through the totalization of war, right? So this is the vision that sort of replaced the 70s vision, which I'm, both of them, but it starts to make you think that maybe the 70s one was, well, at least a little less dark. Where do I see the major sort of driver of this? The book goes back 500 years, so I think settler colonialism is a big part of the story, but the conclusion of the story is that liberalism, that actually this isn't the vision of realists, it's not particularly the vision even of the people who are in military settings that we might think of as sort of martial theorists. It's really in a vision of liberalism, which tried to overcome what they thought were the, in some sense, failures of politics, right? Difference, scarcity, distribution, governance, through a means of engineering, right? So it tried to make the future predictable, at the very least manageable. There's this great J.G. Ballard quote, which is in the book. It says, "I would sum up my fear about the future in one word: boring." And his point is that he was concerned that we'd become a kind of suburb of the soul, which in the book I identify as being actually quite explicitly the dream of people like eco-modernists and others that want to create super cities, dealing from nature, use technology as a kind of way out. I think that's also a pretty good description of how most people view Mars. Look at Elon Musk's version of Mars, it's basically a giant mall. Look at the UAE's Mars program, it's a mall and a police station. And so you basically, you think of a way out of the future as the future getting better or progress as the limiting of surprises. So this led me to ask kind of a question, which is whether or not in this sense, a kind of liberal geopolitics was a form of nihilism. In a sense, it was a way to try to remove from life excitement, any kind of disturbance, the unknown, the novel, the new. And I wanted to think about what the consequences were of a nihilistic geopolitics. This is sort of Nietzsche's definition of nihilism from 1887. What does nihilism mean? The highest values devalue themselves. So in the book, I try to show the ways in which seemingly the laudable goals of things like liberal internationalism, and in some cases realism of the offensive variety, which thought that it could kind of minimize war through dominance, end up devaluing themselves. How do they create situations where actually the worst possible outcome is produced instead of the best? Lewis Mumford is sort of one of the inspirations to the book. He's like the American version of Heidegger. If Heidegger hadn't been the worst dissertation advisor ever, a Nazi, and also way too interested in metaphysics. Lewis Mumford tried to understand technology from a socio-political perspective rather than a metaphysical perspective. And his concern about America was that we had slavery at the bottom, caprice at the top, mechanization at the bottom, and raw savagery at the top. This is what modern society has come to, was his argument. And this was a claim that he was making actually as an argument for invading Germany, trying to stop fascism. But in this book that it comes from, he made the argument that we were facing exactly the same problem at home. Whereas the fascists were mobilizing warfare as a way to order society, the United States was sort of fully mobilizing industrialization. And he saw both of them as a form of dehumanization. And that was part of the inspiration for me trying to think about what it would mean to say that while there are obvious differences between the United States and Russia, the United States and China, obviously the United States and Nazi Germany, there was something that was becoming generalized, which was a kind of general intellect of martial intelligence, right? That a form of strategic thinking, a form of warfare, as a militarized form of liberalization, was taking hold of politics. And actually, there may be reasons to think was sort of in the United States in the beginning. Just for fun, if you can hear the helicopter coming by right now, that is a Black Hawk followed by an Osprey, which is lovely. I get a team of them over the house pretty much 3 times a day. Hawaii is basically a big military base. So the book is, to put it sort of clearly, a Marshall theory of the Anthropocene from 1492 to the Paris Accords. I'm trying to make an argument for why this idea of progress as being one of sort of incorporating and homogenizing as a means for making the world more predictable, more manageable, and more governable is at the heart of the European geopolitical project. It's at the heart of the American project. And as a result, it shouldn't surprise us then that the Anthropocene that we've inherited is, what later I call the Eurocene. Right? It's an attempt to create a world where geopolitics works, not because geopolitics is inherently the way to order the planet, but because geopolitics was the operating system that was chosen. And institutionalizing that and making it as something like a planetary system, it meant that geopolitics required certain things. And that ranges from settler colonialism to counterinsurgency to managing the planet. So a planet thoroughly terraformed by European geopolitical politics, from the atmospherics to the political. So for me then, we used to talk about things like environmental security back in the 90s and early 2000s, but that's already a non sequitur. Even the way we approach climate change is geopolitical. It's impossible for it not to be. So geoengineering is as much geopolitics as the attempt to rid the Americas of indigenous people. And as a result, the form of change that's privileged by the system is one transformation as homogenization. I don't know how well you can see the image, but that is a pile of skulls entirely from buffalo and bison in the American West. An effort to, one, make land more manageable, more fun for sporting and settlement, and also deprive Native Americans of food. They were actually the same maneuver. In fact, even into the early 20th century, the federal policy was to kill all large animals like buffalo, and particularly anything that was a predator, because it infringed upon the version and vision of nature that America wanted, which was one where sportsmen could enjoy hunting ducks. What is sort of the upshot of the book? And then I can take some questions. One is that decolonization is far from over. If we think about this larger system of homogenization, then the very global order, either liberal or realist, is a project of settlement and colonization. Two, the difference between extractive capitalism and sort of even notions of the Green New Deal are the same vision of cruel optimism. And what I mean by cruel optimism is that they leverage the possibility of a better future with a justification for sadism in the present. And that self-determination is continuously subordinated to the demands of global order. And I think that's more true now than ever has been, and is one where you can really see the spillover between sort of the international politics that I'm often engaged in and the kinds of questions you're probably looking at in the criminal justice system. The reality is that the effort to prevent, say, Guam from being independent is not fundamentally different than preventing Black Lives Matter from being successful. They both represent threat to a particular kind of order. And I think one of the things that unfortunately we'll likely see very early on in the Biden administration is that it's not significantly less of a threat to order to Biden than it was to Trump. I think Biden will be less catastrophically stupid about it, but will be no less committed to managing things like Black Lives Matter, managing things like the abolition of policing, as opposed to supporting them or making any real difference. For that, this is sort of maybe the most speculative claim of the book, which is that we are entering a new phase of economy in which sadism is a form of value. And what I mean by that is that actually you can derive value from killing. And this is a big claim in for the academy because it rivals Marx's claim that you can only get value from labor, which has been one of the things that both market economists and market relied on. You couldn't kill all, you needed them to work. You couldn't kill all the people because you needed them to fight in the military. And one of the things that I explore in the book is that actually the logical conclusion of this grand planetary project of homogenization is one where automation, the creation of machine labor and machine intelligence, delinks that necessity for the population. So for those of you who are Foucault fans out there, that idea in Foucault of biopolitics, where the state was invested in sort of maximizing the population, often cruelly, but nonetheless maximizing its productivity, ceases to be the case when extracting minerals is a source of value and people live on top of them. And so there may in fact be an entire economy in eliminating the people who are on top of them. And so those sorts of forms of settler colonialism that we think of as being historical are certainly not. They're very present. And that we have to think of even newer versions of that when we start considering that the military side of the state and the economic side of the state will be increasingly less dependent upon humans to derive those same forms of value. And as a result, the kind of biopolitical logic, which we often thought of as negative, could actually become quite productive. That is the wholesale killing of populations, the cutting off and abandoning of populations, depriving them of resources, or just ignoring. And in part, this is from a theory which I borrowed from an old political scientist, and then I'm probably going to skip ahead a little bit and just take some questions. But this guy named Carl Deutsch developed this theory of the pathology of power, which is sort of throughout the book. And I think this is a really interesting theory. It's a reason why, you know, it puts sort of Nietzsche to the policy table, which is that unfortunately strength prevents learning. So in cybernetics, we tend to think that learning comes from failure and the ability to remember or incorporate failure. The problem with the Euroscene and the way geopolitics work is that it amassed so much material power, so much capability was drawn through its chance encounter with technology that it was able to just basically eliminate dissent. It was able to eliminate those who rebelled or pointed failure out. And as a result, it made large institutions incredibly stupid. When you can leverage power as a way not to learn, meaning when you make mistakes, you destroy the capability to have the failure follow you home, your system doesn't learn. And I think maybe one of the best examples of this is the difference between the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War. The first Gulf War is declared an immense success. We take all the data from it. Elliot Cohen takes that data and tries to build this big data set out of it so that we can define how air power works. We use that data set and say, oh, we can go back into Iraq and have exactly the same success. The reality is that the first Iraqi conflict was not a success. In fact, it strengthened Saddam Hussein's hold. It limited the rebellions that were against him. It nearly wiped out the Kurds. And it left, you know, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis starving as a result of sanctions. But we didn't learn that lesson because none of those lessons came to American shores. And so we had a level of confidence and hubris going into the second war, which made us think that the Iraq war would end very quickly. And that time, we didn't quite have the overwhelming authority or the overwhelming resolve to eliminate failure, as it were. And as a result, we're starting to see already, even now, you know, more than a decade after, the long-term consequences of those kinds of failures. So that's sort of a core theme or concept, and that's a good link argument for debate, which is the pathology of power, the degree to which actually strengthening hegemony caused the state to corrode. It caused leadership in democratic institutions to corrode. Order and security reinforces stupidity. When you can't learn from your mistakes because you try to pretend they don't exist, or you destroy them, or you vaporize them, you get very stupid. And so as a result, we've ended up in a kind of slow motion catastrophe where, while the people most privileged in institutions haven't borne the brunt of the last 500 years of failure, they are starting to come home, right? They're starting to show up in the forms of things like climate change and the inability to negotiate international order in a way that would be more just or humane, and the incapacity to move towards trying to address things like indigenous genocide or slavery. Those incapacities, which really aren't technical problems, they're first and foremost political problems, are reaching the state of apocalypse, catastrophe, precisely because of the inability to learn. So I just skip a couple of things and get to the end. So the end of the book, I basically say that's because we've been so invested in trying to make the world what we want, rather than believing in this world, which is how Jill Deleuze put it, that the thing that's most important that we can do is to believe in this world. So in the book, I say that it's more important to think about how we should live rather than if we live. And that this sort of attempt to get out of a world where the future is what disciplines the present, and how to think about that as a crisis of meaning rather than as a crisis of technology or politics. That we have a crisis of meaning. We don't know even why we want hegemony anymore. And you see that, I mean, I wouldn't have thought it in debate, a million years ago, but I spend as much or more time with generals and members of NATO and, the joint forces in South Korea than I do with the people who read the kind of French philosophy that I like to do when there's nothing else to do. But it's still even a crisis of meaning for them. They're not sure what NATO's for anymore. They're not sure what we want to build hegemony for. We're not even really sure what kind of wars we want anymore. And I think that speaks a lot to the fact that there's not a clear vision of what kind of order we'd even want if we could have it. So, the book kind of ends with this idea that extinction is inevitable, like the sun will burn out, humans will evolve into something else, but nihilism isn't. Nihilism is a problem we can actually do something about. We can think about how to make more meaningful lives and less cruel lives, even if those lives are not going to go on forever. So, in old school debate terms, I have no idea if those apply anymore at all. That's as close to an alternative as the book sort of presents, which is like how to formulate, craft, practice, habits, forms of life, which are not dependent upon the homogenization or liquidation of other forms of life. How to basically, find some joy in this world rather than investing all of our efforts in transforming the world into something which now we're not even sure we want anymore. And certainly through a process of transformation that looks like it may kill the species. So that's where it ends. It's sort of an affirmative note, but I wouldn't say a particularly happy note. And it ends with a question, if that's the ethical move to make the world less cruel, then we have to ask the question, what if this future isn't ours, right? What if humanity isn't the punchline to the cosmic joke? What if there's something else? What comes next? And maybe we should rethink who gets to decide what comes, rather than presuming that those who are already in power, that already maintain the geopolitical institutions, which currently define the agenda for planetary politics, who've done a lot of harm, maybe they should take a step back. And I think that's the thing that makes people the most uncomfortable. People are willing to think about being critical. People are willing to think about incorporating climate change into security. People are willing to think about even incorporating human security or indigenous rights into a security framework. What they're often not willing to do is to give up the sovereignty to decide what is included and what isn't. And for me, that's the most important thing for us to do, is positions of incredible privilege and incredibly destructive power, to be willing to put faith in those people we've basically tormented for 500 years and see what other kind of planet could be made. And that's a big gamble, but I think that's kind of where we are as a species. All right, I will stop the share and we can move to questions. And I've got a list of questions, so if people don't pop up, we can dig into Dustin's list.
Yeah, just for reference, my internet was being a little funky, so I've switched over to my phone, but I'm happy to pass the questions along. You can hear me all right, yeah? Cool.
Yeah,
right.
You're fine. I have the Q&A box open.
Okay, awesome.
Do you want to do you want to start with those, and then if it trickles out, then we'll jump over. You've got some good like middle of the road questions, and I also heard that my friend Ben Tallis's article got cut for answers to me. So we can definitely talk about the Talus response.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't know. I think Ben and I would both think that that was hilarious. I mean, Ben literally works for NATO and also used to work for Frontex, the border control in Europe. So he just, you know, we talk all the time, but we couldn't have more kind of polar opposite worldviews in terms of what is and isn't possible for Europe. He thinks basically Europe should run the world. I think they've already done that. So, it's you know,
makes sense.
We can agree on great like late 20th century German bands, but maybe not so much in politics. All right, so first question. In chapter 3 of Savage Ecology, you speak a lot about how mercenary police actions against indigenous rebels that seem like freelance acts of killing are still built in a category of warlike relations. Do you think in a similar way the organization of the prison and police state are built in those war relations? That is a fantastic question. And the answer is yes, but in a slightly more subtle and settled way. And I want to talk about the subtlety and the settledness. The best example of this is every single cop show that's ever been on television. The bad cop in the interrogation moment always leverages how terrible prison is as an effort to try to extort a confession or some kind of cooperation out of the criminal. Think about that. That literally the way in which an interrogator has authority in the kind of popular cultural mind is to leverage the failure of the prison to produce order. And what do? Right? They make allusions to racist gangs in prison. You know, we'll put you in the white block or we'll put you in the black block, and you don't want to know how that's going to turn out. They think about the ways in which prison isn't a form of confinement, which is what it's on the book supposed to be, but it is actually a form of punishment, and often sadistic punishment. That in some sense, the most hyper, carceral institution is the one that's the least legal. And for me, that's a sort of perfect definition of war, which is one in which we don't have legal or political relations, right? Instead, we have relations of violence and in some cases, sadism. And, that's a bit in tension. So I call those warlike relations. And the reason I call them warlike is because actually war doesn't always have to play out that way. And in fact, there are many instances of war in which actually combatants are equal, right? In the sense that they both have the ability to take away each other's life. There are even cases in which, there isn't enmity in war. They're fighting because that's just where they found themselves. And they don't have any particular dispute with the person they're trying to kill. And that sounds even more terrifying, but actually it's a lot less because that investment in cruelty isn't necessarily there. One of the arguments I make in the book, though, is that there was a major break in Europe in the tradition of war from a tradition of wars of exhaustion, which were fought sort of before the Napoleonic era, in which the point was defeat, not destruction. And then the forms of wars of annihilation, which you really see begin in the colonies, and then in Europe also during the Napoleonic era. And it industrializes and becomes sort of normative after the Napoleonic era, particularly World War I and World War II. But even in its worst forms, I think in Dresden, for instance, you never see the level of cruelty that's practiced in warlike relations in the colonies. So in the American Southwest, in Africa, in South America, in parts of Asia, you see war as a form of extermination becoming the dominant mode. And so there is a bit of an argument in the book that those states, which became states through that incredibly sadistic and incredibly destructive form of wars of annihilation, continued to incorporate those techniques of warfare in their making of sort of modern state militaries. And so it's not like the United States rediscovered counterinsurgency after 9/11. It's a practice of warfare, from the very beginning of the U.S. state. And I think there are even people in the military who realize that is a feature, and there are folks in the military who like to rid that as a feature of the military. There's not a consensus in the military that the United States should be an empire or the United States should be involved in nation building. But for those who support empire and nation building, for me, that's an extension of Western settlement. Okay, how do you think debate as a space is implicated within what you describe as the ecology of war and or the Eurocene? That's a good question. You know, I mean, debate's an ambivalent space, right? Debate is, how do I say this? You know, I don't think I could do any of the things that I do without having been a debater. There's just like, there's no way to walk into a room full of people who want to disagree with you or want to disprove something that you've said publicly that prepares you quite like debate. Interesting question. You know, it prepares you to understand multiple perspectives. I think it prepares you to do research at a level that most people wouldn't bother doing. I do think it also makes you capable of a certain kind of empathy. And here I'll sound like some of the old framework debates I used to spend a lot of time debating against rather than for. But I do, while I don't think that there's an imperative for switch sides debate, I do think that it's imperative that debaters be friends. You know, like one of the people I had the most fun debating over my college career was a guy named Brian Ray from Kentucky. We could not have agreed on less during debates. I mean, literally like every debate was an impact turn. There was no middle ground. But we loved arguing with each other. We loved debating each other. And as a result, I think I took a lot of ideas much more seriously than I would have, precisely because I wanted to debate well against somebody I disagreed with. And that kind of agonism, which is not the same thing as antagonism, I think is really important. And I think it's a hard distinction to draw, but finding that balance between agonism and antagonism, between agonism and enmity, is essential for getting the most out of debate. When debate becomes only antagonism, when it's only a process of eliminating your enemy, then I think a debate produces exactly the kind of like, you know, argument for hire, which I don't think is great about debate. You know, the idea that things like your particular political commitments or ethics or integrity wouldn't constrain some way who you'd write arguments for, what campaigns you would help out, like that would be a problem. The irony is that, you know, I think that was often a sort of accusation of debate. I'm not really sure it produced that. I do also know that, you know, like my year, there was a guy named Michael Horowitz, which people probably read debate cards from too. And, you know, people joke, mostly just Lupo, that we were like, you know, voted most likely to fight wars against each other. You know, we both end up in international relations, we end up on different sides. And it's actually been, the opposite has been the case, vastly more. So, you know, we still have serious disagreements, but I think that if debate's done right, it should produce in you a bit of humility. And when it doesn't, when it produces hubris, when it produces confidence about the world, then I think it can become a training ground for the kinds of disconnected rationalities which don't consider the destruction that's wrought when they're raised to the level of policy or military strategy. So I hope that answers the question. Okay, I've got no other questions there, so I can dig into some of Dustin's if you want.
Yeah, I can. I was actually thinking, if you don't mind, kind of jumping between a few of them / grouping a couple of them together. Awesome. So I want to kind of touch on the idea that you forward in the book about failed IR, particularly as a paradigm for research. I guess first thing, what is there kind of a distinction or a distinct purpose of a failed IR research agenda beyond that kind of what I'm at least understanding is a sort of like more individual centric ethos of imagining that world beyond us or beyond humanity that you were kind of talking about near the end of your general overview?
I don't think of that as individualistic, so we should talk about that for a minute. Sure. I'm not a big fan of the individual. You know, I mean, a lot of the folks who are my students and I hope I can inspire a little bit, or, you know, at least help out a little bit, are trying to build whole nations around those ideas. So I don't think there's anything, I think, you know, if I were to look back at anything on my debate career that I would be like, ooh, cringe, that the dichotomy that we presume between individuals and states, micropolitics and macropolitics, does not exist in the real world at all. The reality is that you're doing all of them all at once, and if you can't walk and chew gum, you can't do either. And so, you know, when I'm talking about a crisis of meaning, I'm not talking about for individuals, I'm talking about for collectivities. There's no such thing as an individual. You couldn't develop language with one person. You certainly can't share meaning with one person. We are collectivities. Sometimes we're communities. We're always assemblages. And so, you know, failed IR for me was about particularly addressing a community for which I felt a lot of love for, which were a lot of other IR scholars, a lot of other IR practitioners, people working in government and NGOs, and thinking that we didn't have to consider only whether or not we change the world in some grand or sort of revelatory sense, the way you think about a revolution, to think that there was value in what we were doing. That sometimes the value was in sharing a disdain for cruelty. Sometimes the value was in trying to make things a little bit better in often much more humble ways. Sometimes it was just the fact that we bothered to try it all. And that way of thinking about IR might give us a way to choose between not giving up entirely on it, which I felt like some critical traditions tried to do early on. They were like, we need to get rid of all IR altogether. We shouldn't be thinking about global politics. And that seemed really misguided to me. And the other extreme, which is, oh, wow, we need to know everything about geopolitics and we need to define its agenda. And I think that's really dangerous. And so, you know, failed IR was a way to kind of like give the finger to those who I thought were vastly too confident about things that had hurt, in some cases, millions of people. And the desire to kind of give up on it altogether. You know, like, I'm not, you know, I don't want to take it as a mean stab, but like, you know, there are some IR theorists who are like, oh, what we need as an alternative is poetry. And I love poets, but poetry is not an alternative to international relations. Maybe the spirit of the poet should infuse IR more, but, you know, IR is the only sort of alternative international relations. So, you know, when I talk to my friends in Guam who are trying to think about self-determination, you know, yeah, it's a question of changing a form of life, and it's a question of trying to get outside of empire. But then it's also very practical questions like, you know, how do you make sure that if the US leaves, China doesn't just take over? And those are no less meaningful questions, even if they're guided by a sense that it shouldn't be, oh, well, if China might take over, we shouldn't bother struggling for independence. You know, if self-determination is as important as I think people believe that it is, then, you know, it means risking that China's going to take you over. And then what kind of things, what sacrifices, what ways of life would you be willing to give up to prevent that? And so I think it's, you know, to use debate terms, it's more like risk calculus than it is a dichotomy between the individual or the group or the state or the micro or any of those things. It's, you know, kind of what are you willing to live and die for, rather than what are you willing to postpone enjoyment for and kill for, might be the most blunt way to put it.
That makes a lot of sense. That actually answers a lot of the other questions that I had written down. I still have a couple, but it looks like a couple more of
yeah, but I tried to incorporate
popped up in the QA.
Let's see. I see. Given your background in debate and status as an active member of academia, what do you think debate as a community misconstrues in its reduction of academic areas like philosophy, international relations, into debate arguments? Oh yeah, this is like a favorite of academics to say, oh, debaters, they do such violence to our work. You know who does a lot of violence to the work? Other academics. The reality is, like, I had as many incredible philosophical conversations in debate as I've had outside of debate. I think it just depends on the opportunity. You know, there was this guy who's now a comparative literature scholar who I used to judge all the time, named Andrew Leung. And the debates that Andrew and this guy Asher Haig used to have were as good as any presentation I've ever seen at a conference. And those have been presentations in cases that involve people like Judith Butler and Slavoj Žižek and all the names you probably hear in debate still. So I don't think there's a hard distinction. I think where the distinction takes place is when the technical character of debate loses its value. And this is another nihilism moment. Going fast is awesome. In fact, the hardest part about going to graduate school and going to conferences is like how slowly everyone speaks. It's just painful. I got over it after 5-10 years, but it took a while. I just like, you're like, get to the argument. Like, I already know the argument you're going to say because you've telegraphed it so much. Just say it. It's hard. That part of debate, I think, is amazing. It means we can have more in-depth conversations in less time and less things. But, for me, when people tried to let cards do the arguing for them, when people tried to basically have evidence suck out all the time in the speech over analysis, when debaters stopped trying to craft arguments, which then maybe they had evidence for, and instead just let the sort of evidence make the argument for them, then that's where I think that the misconstruing happens. Because in the academy, arguments change, and the goal isn't to try to just like build a wall around your book or your article and hope no one criticizes it, which is like the funny part about the Tallis argument. Like, we've had a million arguments over whether or not, I'm actually a nihilist deep down inside. I mean, I think the answer to that is no, because I get up every morning and I still bother to work with the military and I still try to make the world different in different ways. But, I'm going to keep having that argument. I don't want that argument to stop. I don't particularly want to win it. I want to figure out what, how to make sense of it. So, talk more, read less would be my how to prevent debate from misconstruing the academy. What position have you seen groups of self-determination take against war hawks in their scholarship? Oh, all kinds of positions. A lot of my students were involved in taking Mauna Kea back so that they couldn't build a telescope there without permission, and to think about self-determination. I think a lot of my students, and myself included, are very involved in trying to think about how to demilitarize this island, which is hyper-militarized. The military, basically dominates about 50% of the whole state, and it makes certain forms of life very difficult. I think the trick is figuring out that actually, weirdly, the hawks are not always the hard ones. Sometimes it's just the bureaucrats. Change is slow, but it's just part of the process. So, I think one of the things that it's becoming clear, and I've been thinking about it a lot more, and I'm involved in trying to organize a bit about right now, is it's really hard to convince those who are doing military training to understand what military training feels like for those who are not part of the training exercise. And the just unimaginable damage that's done when fighter jets are, flying too low over elementary schools, and, false missile alerts for nuclear weapons dominate people's imaginations after they've actually happened, and the ways those get re-triggered by helicopters, bombs being detonated, live fire rounds being used that echo through people's communities. There's a kind of relationship between, in Hawaii in particular, indigenous communities and military training, which I would compare to the work that we think about when we think about how environmental racism uniquely impacted minority communities, particularly those near the U.S.-Mexico border, and those in African-American communities where industrial pollutants weren't thought of as being significant. It's just a constant spillover effect, what Rob Nixon calls slow violence. So I think making those things more apparent is really important, and often isn't very interesting to IR scholars because it's not a quote unquote real war. But I'll say that, the casualties are significant. A large component of the formulation of the Eurocene as a concept seems to be an understanding of warfare as constitute not only the antagonistic exchange between nation states as traditionally understood within wargaming studies, traditional IR, reading alliance structures, but also the forms of imperial and colonial warfare inflicted by the nation states on the alternative modes of life. Common response to this reconceptualization of warfare as a concept seems to be that warfare cannot be both an antagonistic exchange between nation states and imperial and colonial. Well, that's silly. I mean, I guess that may be true, but that would discount almost every war. I mean, all the Napoleonic wars were about taking territory and trying to colonize other parts of Europe. And those are the wars which really define the kind of modern imagination. Certainly World War I, particularly at its end, was about how to divide up the colonies to further balance the great powers. And World War II, similarly, to attempt to not repeat the errors of World War I, basically divvied up different forms of trusteeship to try to recreate the same thing through colonial practices. And I'll just remind everybody that, you know, decolonization, the reason why it's not over is because the largest, most powerful country in the world didn't engage in decolonization, meaning lots of parts of the world were decolonized, but the US was not. And so settler colonial states have a uniquely deformative impact on the international order in a way that colonial states do not. That's not to say colonial states aren't incredibly destructive, but the problem with settler colonial states is they don't even think of themselves as colonials. And so you almost can't even have the argument. Let's see. Yeah. Did you add something? Sorry, more popped up. Yeah, it is a project of you know, it's talking about a post-colonial world. That's one of the reasons why I almost never use that term post-colonial. Presumes that somehow we're after colonization. We've entered, you know, maybe other destructive periods, but periods that don't resolve or require colonization. But, you know, Australia, the United States, Israel, you know, there are others, but those are sort of the biggies. They're colonial states. They're still colonies. They're just settler colonies. China is definitely getting into the settler colony game. They may do it a little bit differently, but you know, Russia. So, you know, I think trying to separate those as if they were different kinds of things would make understanding the second Iraq War, actually both Iraq wars, just impossible, right? You couldn't even understand where the hubris would come from that you could manage another state if you didn't have the backdrop of colonialism and the existing security politics of settler colonialism. And that's not just because, you know, we use all sorts of crazy settler names when we go to war. It's not just the language, it's literally the practice of it. You can draw a straight line through the securing practices of counterinsurgency from the war against the Sioux to the Philippines to Iraq. And it's, you know, if you think that's conspiracy theories, then just go read dissertations at West Point. They were thinking about them comparatively, and they still do. So I think, you know, particularly for the United States, you know, it gets a little dicier when you start talking about countries which haven't been at the forefront of the colonial game in a long time, but it's certainly still a huge part of the way that France thinks about power politics and also about warfare. Certainly the British, because you got to remember the British colonized Ireland and still do. So it's, I mean, for me, it's at the heart of it. So it's a sort of non-starter.
Well, I think that's all the Q&A questions as of right now. We only got a little bit of time left, although if you're willing to answer a couple more, that's super appreciated.
Like I said, I cleared the day, so it's fun. I tried to find somewhere I still have my T-shirt from going to the University of Michigan debate camp. It was just when we moved last time, I found it in this like bag my mom had saved. It was the immigration. In fact, yeah, it was. I wouldn't have gone to debate camp except for the University of Michigan gave me a scholarship to go to debate camp.
That's awesome. Those are collector's items nowadays. So one question, kind of following up on some of the things you were saying earlier, particularly in terms of like both what, you know, academics, movements, et cetera, are doing in ways to resist some of the deleterious effects of, you know, militarism, colonialism, et cetera, and also what you were saying about kind of keeping in mind some of those questions about like, you know, what are we going to do if China takes over, et cetera. I guess, do you have any kind of guiding points or advice in terms of like what should guide our responses to those kind of questions? Like, for example, in debate, you know, there's the common argument, both in, you know, debates about your stuff and in general in critique debates, is the transition wars argument that liberalism, hegemony, et cetera, are going to go down fighting. Do you have thoughts about, the kind of ethos that should guide our responses to that?
If I were like on the old man seniors tour, my response would be the last couple chapters of my book. I mean, we're in a transition war. The problem with the transition wars arguments is the uniqueness claim. For 90% of the planet, transition wars are a daily fact of life. What happens in the streets of Ferguson are transition wars. What's happening, to Uyghurs in China are transition wars. What's, happening, frankly, in Mexico and trying to figure out how to deal with the cartel wars, those are transition wars. And so you always have to ask the question, and for me, this is sort of the ethical standard, and it's an ethical gamble. I don't have like a Kantian position for it, but transition for whom? So it's true, if we had transition wars, it would be much more violent for those who are in positions of incredible privilege. For those who've been at the receiving end of normatively considered policing actions, which are transition wars, for the last 5 centuries, it's not an increase in violence, it's the possibility of something else. And so for me, like, I would rather think about those people who've had to bear the brunt of the last 500 years getting a chance at steering the ship a bit. So I'm less worried about the fact that, our countries may get drawn in a bit more. The other thing I would say is that, it's another not terribly compelling debate argument, but is a compelling life argument, which is those transitions are inevitable. And I mean, they are truly inevitable. And they're already happening. So like, evilists mean by transition wars are already happening. The alliance system is fractured. I mean, I know it's still in place, but when people look across the table at each other now, you don't see the confidence in Korea and the United States that you used to. You certainly don't see that confidence in Europe. When I'm at events in Germany, I don't think anyone, it's like, it's like seeing the most disgusting, revolting, terrifying thing you possibly can on the internet. You can't unsee it. Trump was that thing for most of the liberal order, because Trump represented the possibility that the American population could elect somebody who would completely renege on the promise of the order. And the problem is that creates anxiety. It becomes, something you can't unsee. And I think that's, Biden's not going to like suddenly restore that. Like, even if Biden were Obama, he couldn't suddenly restore that. That'll be something that'll be gnawing at the back of everyone's minds. And this is where the realists, can be a little bit right, which is that, they don't believe alliances can ever hold because they don't think trust can exist when there are sort of the divergent interests of states. Communities and cultures of trust can be built, but I think they're much more easily sabotaged and destroyed than they are designed. And 4 years of sabotage is going to take a lot to undo. So then you're posed with the question: do you like hopelessly try to rebuild an order that wasn't that great to begin with? Or do you decide to throw your weight behind those people who want something else? And for me, like, I don't think that there's no way to know the outcome. It's just a question of the present of who I'd like to struggle with. And you can bleep it out later, but I would rather be against the assholes than sort of cowardly stay out of the fight. And like, we can stop climate change anymore, but why do I support climate change? Because people who are saying climate's not a problem, they are really jerks. Like, they are terrible, terrible people. But I'm wary, right? Because it's also the case that the people who want to stop climate change at all costs are willing to engage in certain forms of neo-Malthusianism and thinking about population control, and they tend to target minority populations and global South populations, and it's all done in the name of saving the planet. So, there's not, the problem is that debate has to have an either or outcome, and life very rarely follows that. But I think in debate terms, it's about thinking about how we make decisions rather than kind of which side of the decision we're on. And if that's the sort of one takeaway of the book, I would be pretty happy about that. I think it's possible to work for the State Department and like reading this book. But you don't work for the State Department because you think you're going to make an American world order. You work there because you think you maybe can make a little bit of difference in the places you can make a difference. And likewise, it's not like there's a shortage of self-determination groups that went horribly wrong. Those things can go horribly wrong too. I just, I like where they're going these days. So I don't know if that answers the question at all, but
I think it absolutely does. One other thing, so it looks like one of the Q&A things that popped up was a duplicate, but another question that popped up that dovetails pretty well, I think, with something you were saying in terms of realists getting it right sometimes. Somebody asked about your thoughts of realism and about realism and how it interacts with your understanding of IR as war making. And one thing I kind of wanted to add on to that is, I guess, like, if you could expound a little bit on like what elements of realist thinking, classical IR thinking, you might, you see value in, or alternatively don't see value in, and what their role is going forward.
I'm a huge Morgenthau fan. I like classical realists. I like E.H. Carr. Classical realists were almost all defensive realists. They all took seriously that things beyond the state influence global politics. They all took seriously how much technology was changing the international system. They did not believe it was structural or recursive. Primarily with structural realists, mostly who came out of the 70s, who believed that realism was a science, that you could ignore what happened inside of states and only think about how states interacted, and that states all interacted in what they called isomorphic ways. Structural defined their range of behavior and interests, being self-preserving, competitive at their nature, sort of interest maximizing. That just seems like, I can't imagine a less nuanced way of seeing the world than that sort of structural realist one. And I'll say, I've never met a classical realist that was an offensive realist. I've only met offensive realists that were structural realists. And I think that's because you would never have the confidence to start a war on purpose if you believed in a world as being as complex as classical realists thought it was. You have to live in a world where you think that states are billiard balls and that only a few of them matter, and that it's a sort of system that can be understood and analyzed with relative simplicity, to think that it's worth starting a war on purpose. So I don't tend to get along very well with structural realists. I don't tend to get along very well with offensive realists. I get along very well with defensive realists because they tend to have more humility than liberals. They tend to think that you can't just change the world because you want to. And they may have different reasons, like human nature or something like that, which I might take issue with. But I think they tend to kill a lot less people. I always remind people that Clinton killed more Iraqis than both the Bushes combined, and that's something worth remembering. And I'm not sure that George H.W. Bush would have sabotaged the effort to stop the Rwandan genocide in the way that Clinton did. Clinton did it because he didn't want to fracture the international system. Because he knew the United States was likely not to stay in the war, and so the only way to stay out of it entirely was to deny that a genocide was taking place. And so in order to save face, we killed 800,000 Rwandans. Realists may have just said, well, fine, we'll pull out of the genocide convention, but we won't stop everybody else trying to stop it, which is what the Clinton did. So, all of these ideas can be dangerous in the wrong hands. That's part of the reason, by the way, that I get along. So, I think people were freaked out because I published this report I was involved in this report for the Air Force, but I get along well with a lot of people in the military. A lot of the generation that were deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan never want to be involved in nation building ever again. They lost friends, they saw horror shows. It seemed like a total waste of resources. It was catastrophic. There are a lot more defensive realists, particularly amongst those who've actually served in combat. So I tend to get along very well with combat veteran parts of the Department of Defense. I tend to get along very poorly with the ones that have never left a boardroom and have an incredible amount of confidence in technological innovation as a way to perfect war. And that's the part that makes it fun for me to engage them, because I think there is still a voice in the military that would like to say, maybe national security should be very narrowly defined, and maybe the goal shouldn't be a new jet fighter. It should be how to hold on to certain kinds of principles and things like that. Which is not to say that the military can be perfected, but like every other institution, the military is made of people, and is a highly fractured system and not a consensus. And I think that's one thing that's hard to transition out of debate from. In debate, we tend to be a bit platonic. We like to think in terms of ideal types, the state, the individual, resistance, co-optation, permutations, alternatives. In reality, systems are incredibly messy, they're incredibly complex, and better and worse are actually very difficult to find, and you have to find them where you can, and when you can, you just hold on to them the best you can. So.
Awesome. If you don't mind, I have kind of two other questions to follow up on.
Sure.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So number one, kind of following up actually on what you were just saying about the world being messy. Somebody sent me a question, and I'm also curious about your thoughts on the recent turn in IR scholarship towards quantum theory and integrating it. I know it's something you've written about before, yeah. And curious about your thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, that project was interesting because it started out, it's still ongoing. James Jarius invited me to become part of it almost 5 years ago. And it was really about quantum computing. And what our concern was that quantum computers were going to be game-changing the way that nuclear weapons were. And that because we could see it coming, maybe we could have better conversations about it before it happened than after it happened, right? Before it entered the stage of secrecy and intense competition the way it did during the Manhattan Project for nuclear weapons. So we could have a kind of pre-Manhattan Project debate over quantum computers. And I think actually a lot of that has happened, and I think it's really important, and with a lot of opportunities for very different kinds of people. And I learned a lot from the physicists who were generous enough to give us their time, and the philosophers and artists and everyone else involved. Now, what quantum theory does for IR is a different question. Quantum theory, I think, well, it really depends on which quantum theory. So if you want to, you can go read the article I wrote about it, which kind of compares quantum theory with a lot of the early philosophers who influenced people like Deleuze. So like William James, Alfred North Whitehead, Peirce, others, Dewey. Quantum theory, in its like big version, as the way that people think about like the Copenhagen school, let the air out of the Newtonian vision of the world, that it was sort of ordered, rational, predictable. Quantum mechanics just created a more effective, even more structured version of Newtonianism. And so, it sort of depends on where you are on the quantum physics spectrum. There's a version of quantum physics which should mean that with sufficient data, we could model the entire international system. And there's a vision of quantum physics which doesn't believe initial conditions determine outcomes, which suggests that we could never model the international system. For me, both of those questions sort of belie a different question, which is, why would we want to? What happens if the international system can no longer surprise us? Like, for whom does that serve? And so I think the interesting thing about quantum politics is that none of the quantum physics makes the politics any easier. It actually just means that the dangers are higher. And that was just as true of cybernetics and still is. It's certainly true of machine learning and algorithm sort of intelligence. It doesn't change the fight. It just changes how much gets destroyed in the actual conflict. Cybernetics made almost every system informatic, which meant we could study and alter and manipulate things from climate to genetics. Quantum theory means potentially that we could manage things even at the level below the atom, which means things like nanotechnology, basically alchemy, would become science. We could alter matter. And people are like, oh, that's awesome. We could turn deserts into rainforests. And that's great, unless there are people in that desert and they didn't want to live in a rainforest. And that's great, unless that throws the whole system off balance. And that's great, unless that's what you want to do with it, instead of realizing that everything is potential energy, which means that that capacity to manipulate things below the atomic level means that you can turn a building into a bomb and you don't need explosives. So it's it's the old Foucault line, but it's one I live and die by. It's not that everything is either good or bad, but that everything is dangerous. And I think quantum thought is no more or less dangerous than anything that came before it, but it opens a whole new horizon of what's possible. And also what's thinkable, and that makes a significant difference. So, I don't think that there's a sort of like, I think there were some people, I think even James Derderian, I think still thinks this a bit, that particularly the insights of the Copenhagen School bring with them a certain kind of ethical humility. And I think that's what a lot of new materialists think too, that a sort of openness to ecology opens a humility. Studying war for the last couple decades suggests to me that there's nothing that intrinsically opens humility. Anything that opens humility can also open a new desire for control. So being able to manipulate or manage matter, or being able to understand that, the world is unbreakable or recursive or anything else could just as easily cause humility, or it could lead to, what von Braun said, one of the Nazi members of the Manhattan Project, which was that he thought the universe was unbreakable. So if we destroyed this planet testing nuclear weapons, that's okay. There'll be another planet out there. For me, that's like supreme nihilism. So I think, there are no guarantees that if we get just the right worldview, everything else will fall into place. It's sort of ethics and politics all the way down.
Awesome. That makes a lot of sense to me. To wrap things up, actually, the last thing that just got popped in the Q&A was actually one of the things I was going to ask about, which is going back to talking about the Ben Tallis's article a little bit. Curious about your thoughts, and particularly on one of the questions that I'd sent you in terms of the claim that Tallis makes, and I've seen other people make, that forwarding, yeah, exactly. Like what does pessimism do to respond to the fascists and nostalgic politics?
It's silly. I don't know. The article's a little silly. Well, two things I'll say. I'm a bona fide fascist fighter, and and then I've started more fights with the Proud Boys than probably maybe anyone else in Hawaii. But what? Oh, hold on. Yeah, sorry,
yeah,
you're
no problem.
breaking up. But I think also the notion that pessimism somehow leads to fascism sort of misunderstands the erotic economy of fascism. In fact, quite the opposite. I think the kind of cruel optimism of liberalism causes fascism. So when you see a lot of these people and you see kind of what they've done, then I think it's mostly been because liberalism was boring, right? Like look at the Proud Boys. Look at the way that fascism thrives on fighting and warfare. It's because they're tired of not doing something. They're tired of waiting around for something to pay out. I think the revelatory moment of pessimism is that it's okay if things don't turn out okay. There are actually incredibly important, joyful, exciting, thrilling, ethical ways of living which are not dependent upon being able to manage an outcome, being able to determine an outcome. And I would say one of the best examples of that is the fight against fascism. When the Spanish Civil War happened and the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, which were a bunch of Americans who had no affiliation with the military, poured in to fight Franco, they didn't go because they thought they could win. They went because they couldn't live with themselves not having fought. And I would just say that most of the most important struggles, whether or not it was the Black Panthers, it was the struggle for Indian independence, they didn't happen because they saw a strategic opening and they thought it could work. It happened because they weren't willing to live with a form of life that accepted the terms of fascism. So for me, it's the opposite. I don't think you inspire people to fight fascism with hope. I think knowing just precisely how bad things are is liberatory. It makes people decide what they think really matters. And that doesn't mean it'll save us from fascism, but certainly those who have saved us from fascism, I think, engaged a pessimistic worldview, not an optimistic one. They didn't fight because they thought they could win. They fought because they wanted to die fighting. So, you know, does that mean that pessimism will always win? You know, no, I don't think so. I'm being a bit cheeky about pessimism, and I think Ben sort of missed that point. What I mean by pessimism is realism, but like in the epistemological sense, not in the like realpolitik sense, not in the IR sense. We're all convinced at some very basic level often that things will work out. And oftentimes that's our alibi for not doing things like fighting against fascism or not trying to overthrow a leader as opposed to waiting for an electoral outcome or to put ourselves on the line. And, you know, I have to call it pessimism because until you're willing to admit that things might actually turn out very badly, then you're not willing to take seriously that that's a real possibility. And so I think pessimism is an ethos for taking the world as it is seriously. And so I think of it as a pessimist realism, not as a like moody pessimism. You know, I'm not interested in like, you know, I mean, I like The Cure, I like some goth bands, but I'm not sitting around like crying in a corner all day. It's just that if we don't consider the worst, which very well may happen, then we're never willing to consider the world as it is. And I think that's where a great deal of hubris and violence comes from, is an inability to accept that the world may not ever be what we exactly want it to be. But that doesn't mean that we can't be better in it. And that means collectively, not just individually, right? That there are better ways to live, even if we're not going to live forever. So hopefully that sort of answers the question.
Yeah, that was very illuminating. Thank you. That's all I've got, I think, and you know we're already a little bit over. I mean, there's one other question that just popped up in the Q&A that you have every right not to answer if you don't want. But
what are your religious beliefs? Oh, those are pretty clear in the book. So you know, I would never describe myself as an atheist because I think atheism is way too confident. The same way that I think most religions are way too confident. So, you know, I just think it's always a sort of metaphysical leap of faith, whatever it is you believe in. And I tend to be on the Whitehead side of things. And Alfred North Whitehead thought that the one thing that he could believe in was that there was a force of creativity in the world, but it was in the world. It wasn't like with a beard sitting over it. It wasn't in a particular religious faith, but that creativity was in a war with entropy. And that entropy was a sort of running out of steam to nothingness, and that creativity was a fragile but insurgent form of making, of novelty, of newness entering the world. And that, you know, that was true at the cosmic scale, but it was also true at the microcosmic scale. And, you know, we could make a kind of decision on which side we would want to be on. And so, you know, I think I picked creativity, and, you know, I'll hold to that. And I might be wrong. Maybe the world's just entropy, but I like to think that the world isn't one thing. And that is sort of, I would say, is not my religious belief, but it is my cosmological belief, which comes with some faith and some philosophy.
Makes a lot of sense to me. All right, I think that's all the Q&A things, and you know, I don't want to, you know, take up too much more time, and I think people are starting to peter out. But thank you so much.
Well, that was fun. Thanks everybody. Thanks for having me. You know, feel free to email.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
All right. See y'all soon.
Bye, everybody.